Invasion. It's the shadowy threat that has loomed over the United States of America since its inception. The deep, dark, fearsome prospect that's kept generation after generation of general and president awake at night. From its early years as a fragile republic to its years torn asunder by civil war, and even now in its full form as a modern superpower, the USA has always feared the prospect of an enemy's march on Washington. The Great American Experiment, as it's so often called, has been going strong for nearly 250 years, but the notion that it could be all ground into dust if its people aren't careful has never really gone away. In truth, however, the prospect of a full-scale military invasion is something that the US hasn't had to worry about for generations. In fact, modern-day United States is about the least invadable place that human civilization has ever created, and by a long shot. From a geography that's simply impossible to match, to a population that's ready to resist at a moment's notice, to a carefully tailored enemies list and a very sneaky approach to grand strategy, the USA has created the best home field advantage in history. Quite simply, a full-scale military invasion of the United States just isn't possible, and here's why. Every country is a castle. It's just as true today as it was in ancient or medieval times, even if borders, populations, and technology have all shifted with time. Above all else, a nation must protect its sovereignty, whether by military defense, by alliance, by integration, or by whatever other means they choose. And while a nation's specific methods and approach are its own, the mission remains the same: maintain one's own independence, protect it, and, well, after that, that's up to a nation's leaders and their people to decide. And if every country is a castle, then the castle that the USA has built simply cannot be compared to any other. The way that we're going to think about the US today is as a series of interlocking rings of defense. A historical castle can be defended on surrounding battlefields, then defended while moving backward toward the highly defensible point where it's located. It'll have exterior ditches or moats, then a vast outer wall, then its inner walls, and probably a whole range of traps, choke points, and defensible areas to get through, all before an adversary can finally break through to the keep and declare victory. Similarly, the idea of American resistance to invasion goes way beyond simple perimeter defense, and it starts with America's presence all around the world. Declare war on the United States with full intention of one day invading the US mainland, and before you even get close, you're going to have to deal with an incredible number of what we'll refer to as mini-Americas. These are the country's foreign bases around the globe, its island territories, and the floating cities that are America's 9 carrier strike groups. In Japan, for example, the United States stations over 50,000 troops, including an aircraft carrier and many large naval vessels, several advanced air combat units, and more. They're backed up by 24,000 more troops in South Korea, including an entire field army's worth of soldiers, major military intelligence capabilities, and enough lethal aircraft to ruin a whole lot more than your day. Germany has 35,000, Italy and the UK each have over 10,000, and Turkey, Spain, Belgium and Bahrain each have 1,000 or more. All told, the US stations troops in dozens of nations around the globe, including in several nations where those troops are currently deployed into active combat. Try and start a war with America, and all of those troops are going to start doing everything in their power to become a problem, and with some 160,000 troops in total stationed outside the US, joined by all manner of advanced warfighting equipment, you'd best believe that they can become a problem. And then there are America's defenses on its own territory and in international waters, far beyond the bounds of the country's contiguous 48 states. Take the island territory of Guam, closer to China, Australia, or the Philippines than it is to Los Angeles. The US Navy, Air Force, and Marines each maintain a formidable presence there, including an anticipated 5,000 Marines starting in the next few years, several nuclear submarines, and a rotating force of strategic bombers. The island archipelago state of Hawaii is even more formidable, featuring F-22 Raptors, tens of thousands of garrison soldiers and Marines, and America's entire Pacific Fleet. Hawaii may be a tropical paradise, but we here at WarFronts do not recommend picking a fight with it. Alaska in the high north represents a similar situation. Making matters worse, America also has its own floating islands, hundreds of them, including nearly a dozen that are otherwise known as aircraft carriers. A modern Nimitz-class aircraft carrier can hold 5,000 crew members, dozens of guided missiles, and anywhere from 64 to 130 warplanes, depending on what sort of onboard nightmare the US Navy has chosen to deploy from ship to ship. The more advanced Gerald R. Ford class can carry up to 90 aircraft and even more missiles while fighting better and sustaining for longer than its predecessor class. Nor are these beasts traveling alone. Each of them will sail alongside guided missile cruisers, advanced destroyers, and quite likely even nuclear submarines. What all of those assets mean, the foreign military bases, the built-up territories, and the carrier strike groups, is that before you even touch the US mainland, you've got to engage in a particularly maddening version of an exercise that we can best think of as island hopping. No matter who's trying to mount an invasion of the US, they're first going to have to deal with nearby bases on land, sometimes home to thousands of soldiers, before then trying to get past all of the layers of defense that the US can set up in the open ocean, on and around island territories, and based out of foreign bases elsewhere around the world that have the capacity to stretch their own resources a considerable distance. Get through that entire sequence of defensive rings, and sure, you might make it to the mainland, but to accomplish such a thing is a brutally difficult task no matter what military we're talking about. And that problem is only made worse by two factors that we have yet to account for: the immense natural advantage of the Earth's oceans and the all-seeing dominance that America has achieved in space. We'll discuss the prospect of a northward or southward invasion of the United States by land in just a moment, but any nation that doesn't plan on attacking the US through Canada or Mexico has a really massive problem to contend with. Other than a single exception at the Bering Strait between Alaska and the far Russian east that really isn't suitable for large-scale military operations anyhow, any attack against the US by sea will have to cross hundreds to thousands of miles of open ocean. Whether from the Atlantic or the Pacific, the waters surrounding the United States are vast, and the problems with crossing them go beyond the extremely difficult island hopping we've just laid out. Even under ideal conditions, a nation can only reach America by sea if it can support a logistical operation to cross a major world ocean. Both during the crossing and once troops could hypothetically establish a presence on the US mainland, those invading forces would have to be supplied and protected across incredibly long lines. And we're not talking about operations on the scale of the D-Day landings, taking advantage of a relatively narrow English channel and the mainland of a major military power on a nearby shore. Instead, we're talking about the creation of supply bridges across an exponentially greater divide. Those supply lines are both very logistically challenging to sustain and vulnerable to constant hit-and-run attacks that are far easier to pull off when your adversary has nuclear-powered submarines than they are to defend against. Not only that, but an invading force can only transport as many troops and military hardware as it can carry across such a great distance. But we'll get to that whole mess in a little while. And if all of that wasn't difficult enough, any US invader will have to manage that ocean-crossing, island-hopping operation with the American military fully aware of where they are, what they're doing, and where they'll go next. The United States surveillance capabilities are second to none, most notably in space, where a wide range of secret satellite intelligence programs can capture imagery and signals data, most likely in real time, at numerous points of interest worldwide, all simultaneously. Other US intelligence and reconnaissance assets include highly advanced spy drones, extreme high-altitude aircraft, and of course, shadowy organizations like the CIA, which is more than capable of leveraging its power and human assets across the globe. By leveraging those abilities, the US can target and attack an adversary's invasion infrastructure with exceptional precision and efficiency, to a degree where any adversary's military strategists would probably conclude that it is just not worth the effort. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. But let's say that we've made it through America's sea-based and international rings of defense, and finally, we've positioned an invading force on US soil, be it the East Coast, the West Coast near the border with Canada, or the border with Mexico. Well, now what? And the answer to that will really depend on the direction that an invader chooses for their attack. But no matter which way you slice it, there are no shortage of natural barriers forming this next inner ring of America's defense. Let's say that you've come from the West Coast, where no matter the location that your troops have landed, you're going to need to breach multiple mountain ranges to get to the American heartland. The first are the Pacific Coast Ranges, running all the way from Alaska to central Mexico and set so close to the sea in some places that you can descend directly from the high coastal hills onto the sparkling waters of the Pacific. Many sections of the Pacific Coast Ranges are very difficult to traverse, with only a handful of passes where tanks or heavy artillery could safely go. Pass through those central ranges, and depending on where across the west coast you've chosen to land, you'll progress to level 2 against one of two adversaries, the Sierra Nevada Range toward the south or the Cascades to the north. Those ranges are choppier, higher altitude, and deeper than the coastal ranges in most places. Get past those, and you'll reach the toughest challenge of all, the Rockies. They're North America's largest system of mountains, with an abundance of peaks above 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters. If you attack it from the East Coast, the situation is a little bit better, but not much. Attack it from the north, near the New England region, and before long you'll run into the White Mountains, and then the Green Mountains and Berkshires, and then the Taconic Mountains and the Adirondack. Attack further south, in the Mid-Atlantic or in the Carolinas, and you'll get a better distance inland. But then you'll run into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, lower in elevation than the Rockies or some of the other western peaks, but thickly forested and very difficult to traverse. So much of a pain are the Appalachians to traverse that even today, transport infrastructure in that region is sparse. Attack from Alaska, working your way down through Canada, and the path isn't any easier. You'll just be following the Rockies for most of it, and that's after you get through the bitterly cold Alaskan ranges, practically overflowing with bears and other large wildlife. Even an attempt to strike northward from the Gulf states will take an invading force through the Ouachita Mountains, a low-lying but hilly range with enough natural obstacles to become a major headache. Now, look, we're not going to dive deep into the specifics of mountain warfare in this episode. If you're interested in learning more about that, we've actually published a separate episode on this channel as part of our Art of War series. But look, to suffice it to say that no matter the range in question, mountains are really difficult for an enemy to overcome. They're very difficult, if not impossible, to move large vehicles through. They're replete with choke points where a defender can stage attacks. They're easy for asymmetric defenders who are familiar with the land to launch a guerrilla-style campaign, and they eat into the time that it takes to pull off an invasion, giving the invaded party time to react and consolidate their forces. Particularly high and cold ranges can pose danger from altitude sickness to frostbite to avalanches and more, while any troops charged with crossing into high mountains will need even more time to acclimate. And even if an invading force attempted to get around the mountain ranges, they'd only have so many options at their disposal. The American Southwest, states like California, Arizona, Mexico, and Nevada, are made up largely of scorching desert where conditions can be incredibly harsh, infrastructure is scarce, and shelter from the elements barely exists at all. The southeastern states of Louisiana and Florida are protected by mucky, hard-to-penetrate bayous filled with alligators and parasites, while any invading force that's able to get through the bayous has now landed in a sort of mosquito territory that simply defies understanding. Come down from the north, and an invader will have to deal with thick forests in a land pockmarked by lakes, making for a slow advance along shaped, predictable pathways that can quite easily be defended. And all along the nation's coasts are its cities, from sprawling Los Angeles and Houston to tightly packed New York, San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, and more. In order to access the main road routes into the heartland, you've got to go through urban areas. And if you're going to attempt that, then you're making a large-scale attempt at the incredibly difficult task of urban warfare. From there, things get even more frustrating. Not only is the United States hard to attack, it's easy to defend, with an innermost ring of defenses that couldn't be a better place to endure a siege if it was designed with that specific purpose. Once you've crossed through America's many barrier lands, you'll find your way to the heartland, broadly referred to as the Midwest. That area is known as the breadbasket of the United States, with immense agricultural potential and the ability to sustain the country's population for a very long time, especially under war conditions. That same heartland is the location of America's industrial base, especially its military manufacturing. M1 Abrams tanks are made exclusively in the heartland state of Ohio. Artillery and shells are made in Pennsylvania, Arkansas, and Iowa, and states like Missouri and Kansas are the hubs for aerospace manufacturing and innovation. The US heartland is host to hundreds upon hundreds of manufacturers of small arms, and it's where America's most potent weapons, its land-based nuclear arsenal, is kept safe and ready to use. Not only that, but Americans can get there rapidly, taking advantage of the country's interstate road system, the same road system that allows the US military to rapidly pivot its defense in times of crisis. While the interstates couldn't manage, say, a 12-hour evacuation of the American coasts, we're talking about a nation here with all the spying capabilities that we've mentioned. Americans won't have hours, they will have weeks, and when they arrive, they'll find no shortage of land waiting for them. Finally, there are the people to consider. Resistance to invasion and the principles of armed self-protection have been essential to America's ethos and self-concept for centuries, and even the country's civilian population has the weaponry to match. Per capita, the US has more firearms than any other nation on Earth, with enough guns to put a weapon into the hand of every adult, child, and even infant, while still having an estimated 65 million or more left over. Now, not all those people will be qualified or even able to use those firearms, but according to publicly available numbers from the CIA, some 120 million American men and women between the ages of 16 and 49 are believed to be fit for military service. Those 120 million people have just been forced to vacate their homes and retreat to the American heartland, with everyone and everything they've ever known under threat, and they're gonna be pissed. Make fun of the Americans for their McDonald's all you want, but do not underestimate their willingness to take McDonald's back by force if you try to take it away from them. And remember, there's still the military to contend with, including 1.3 million active duty service members and 800,000 reservists. At their disposal will be the vast majority of America's global military hardware, including over 8,000 main battle tanks, hundreds of missile defense systems, several thousand fighter and bomber aircraft, and an estimated 15 million veterans of the armed forces, many of whom can re-enter service with minimal need for retraining or can handle the job of getting their fellow citizens capable of taking part in a defense of their homeland. Deal with all of that, and congratulations, you finally made it past the innermost ring of American defense. That assumes, of course, that you've somehow managed to defuse the nuclear weapons on your way without America's leader pressing the big red button and deciding to wipe out an invading force for good. But fail to break past every single ring of defense that we've discussed, and your invasion is a failure. Alright, so those are the reasons that the US is really hard to invade, but we here at WarFronts, we like to keep a bit of skepticism in our analysis, and we imagine that many of you guys probably do the same. So, it's worth pointing out that while we've explained the factors that would make a US invasion very difficult, we haven't actually mentioned anything that's made it impossible. After all, if an adversary could get through all of those challenges, they could complete a successful military invasion, right? To that, we would offer that you are exactly right, but that if a successful military invasion under those terms sounds like something that any world nation could achieve, then you're probably making one of two critical errors. Either you are way underestimating the resources it would take to complete such a mission, or you are massively overestimating the ability of adversarial world nations to actually get it done. And it's here that we're going to pivot from discussing the staggering defensive features and attributes of the US to the massive requirements of an adversarial nation in order to pull off an invasion, and we'll start with a discussion of alliances. If the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are America's guardians to the east and west, then Mexico and Canada are their guardians to the north and south. Diplomatic disagreements notwithstanding, the US, Canada, and Mexico are inextricably linked to each other through trade, military, and economic collaboration, culture, and much more. It is flat out inconceivable that any adversary nation would be able to get Mexico or Canada's consent to even be the launch point for a small cross-border raid against an American town, let alone to amass troops for a full-scale invasion. Not only do Canada and Mexico benefit massively from America's nuclear umbrella and the ability of its military to guarantee regional security, but the military disparity between the US and its neighbors serves as a very good reason to ensure that Washington doesn't perceive a major national security threat coming from their home soil. The idea that North America is a practically impenetrable fortress is very good for every nation on the continent. So, with Mexican or Canadian assistance off the table, any land invasion of the US would require buildup of forces either in remote areas of Canada or Alaska in the north, or somewhere in Central or South America, and then starting a long march toward US soil. As we've mentioned, if you try to do that, the Americans can see you. You're f***ing luck staying alive once they do. With those territories well within range of American missiles, aircraft, and offshore naval assets, and with your invading force only getting easier to aim at as they get closer, the full might of the American military can respond to an approaching land-based threat before it even arrives on US soil. Whether Canada or Mexico would be terribly enthusiastic about having burned out tank columns and ungodly amounts of munitions expended on their territory is an open question, but from America's perspective, that's a fringe benefit of being the continent's heaviest hitter, by an order of magnitude. They get, a bit more leeway to act first and then apologize to their weak neighbors later. If an invasion of the US via Canada and Mexico is a non-starter, then the next best option is an invasion by sea. Again, assuming that all those US forces stationed abroad, all those island and territorial holdings, and all those roving carrier strike groups have somehow been dealt with. And to illustrate the problems with a sea landing point by point, we'll make an assumption for the next phase of the conversation. Let's assume that by some stroke of luck, an invading force is able to mass its troops in Cuba with the intent to attack the Everglades in southern Florida. A huge logistical nightmare in itself, but for now, let's pretend it's not that. So, a sea invasion in that case would need to only cover about 180 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, about 300 kilometers, only double that of the D-Day landings in World War II. In that case, the next constraint on an invading force is its amphibious assault craft, where no single nation on Earth has the capacity to ferry enough troops to US soil at once. The US, unsurprisingly, is the nation with the highest number of amphibious assault ships in the world, but we'll examine the runner-up, China, whose own amphibious assault capability allows it to threaten a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. China has a grand total of 4 copies of its largest amphibious assault ship, the Type 75, each capable of carrying around 60 armored fighting vehicles, 800 troops, and 28 helicopters. Its next biggest amphibious assault ship, the 71, comes in just 8 copies, again with the capability of carrying around 60 armored fighting vehicles and 800 troops, plus 4 helicopters each. It's working on a much larger ship, the Type 76, expected to carry over 1,000 Chinese Marines per ship and launch and recover unmanned drones, but only one ship has been launched so far, and it's not expected to be battle-ready until 2027. It's got about 70 other large landing vessels, typically able to carry about 10 armored vehicles and 250 troops each, although a few can carry more than that, so being generous, we'll bump up our totals by about 25%. We'll even assume that that very large ship is ready to go, and that China can commit 100% of its amphibious landing assault craft to a single invasion. We'll also assume that it can muster a lot of smaller or civilian craft and give itself 50% more troop landing capacity, and the country's soon-to-be 3 aircraft carriers and several dozen destroyers and frigates can keep a landing force completely safe on approach. Even in that incredibly favorable, unrealistic scenario, China could maybe land about 48,700 troops, 1,500 heavy fighting vehicles, and perhaps 300 helicopters on US soil, plus air support from its 2 functioning aircraft carriers and the one undergoing sea trials, combining for maybe 100 aircraft. Granted, that is a highly formidable force, but it is nowhere near the number you'd need to face down the US military on its own soil. Even under perfect conditions, it would be a miracle if such a force could even make it all the way up Florida's peninsula with the full weight of Uncle Sam bearing down on it. Other modern US adversaries like Russia, Iran, or North Korea couldn't even pull close to those numbers, and even if all those nations were to work together under those same perfect conditions, well, it's a losing effort. Take away those perfect conditions, get rid of the assumption that the US would ignore an invading force building up on Cuba, or that one could simply waltz through the Everglades, and we reach a situation that's really, truly impossible. None of those nations could sustain any attack force of a comparable size as it stretched across an ocean. None of them could stop American naval air power, let alone the nation's nuclear submarines, from picking off landing craft and support ships as they made a long Atlantic crossing, or even worse, as they came across the Pacific. At best, those forces could pull off a beach landing of a few thousand troops at highly remote locations, and only if US forces decided to simply let them have their landing zone. If those landing zones were seriously contested with the resources at America's disposal, it would be all over. And don't even bother considering an air invasion. Aircraft like Russia's R-76 or China's Y-20 could only make such a flight if they fully intended to run out of fuel and crash, and if they intended to brave US airspace without escort, given that neither country has any fighter aircraft that could guard these planes on such long flights. Even if both nations sacrificed every strategic airlifter they had in such an attack, and miraculously none of the undefended, unarmed aircraft was shot down, they'd be able to deposit maybe 22,000 unlucky paratroopers with no hope of backup or support. If we assume that such a nation would actually want its strategic airlifters to survive and return to base, then Russia's grand total of 4 airworthy Antonov AN-124s, again with zero protection, could drop a paltry 1,400 paratroopers to face a, quite frankly, embarrassing fate. All that without even touching on the sheer number of troops that would be required on US soil to hold the territory and put down resistance if some other nation were to successfully mount a takeover. For reference, at the height of the Iraq War, the US stationed over 170,000 troops in the country and still proved unable to prevent a long-term return to violence. And Iraq is barely 2/3 the size of a single US state, Texas. Quite frankly, the possibility of any world nation to even be in a position to deal with that problem is so remote that we're best off simply suggesting that you don't worry about it. The logistical challenges of placing adversary troops on US soil are so completely prohibitive that even a fraction of US forces could handily defeat the largest possible invading army that another nation could put on its soil. Russia couldn't do it, China couldn't do it, Russia and China couldn't do it together, a hypothetically hostile Europe couldn't do it, India, Brazil, Iran, North Korea, it's just not happening, guys. Of course, we'd be remiss to conclude today's episode without a little bit of attention to a broader reality. Just because the United States couldn't be properly invaded doesn't mean that it can't be attacked. In fact, the sheer impossibility of a military invasion of the country creates a double-edged sword. Yeah, the US can rest assured that it won't have to fear military invasion for at least several decades. But because launching an attack on the US via those means is so unlikely, America's adversaries have greater incentives to work out alternative modes of attack. Some nations, like the Soviet Union of old and the Russia and China of today, pour themselves into the work of nuclear proliferation. Russia and the US have nearly the same number of nuclear weapons deployed today, with China on pace to match both nations within a decade or two as it rapidly expands its stock. Neither Russia nor China can threaten the US with invasion, but they can threaten to do incredible harm to America, so they basically take another route to recoup the deterrent and negotiating power that comes with the ability to directly harm an adversary. Economic warfare, too, is a potent tool against the United States, as it appears that the US and its rivals will be playing out over the next few years. From US-led sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Ukraine to trade wars between Beijing and Washington, nations can do real economic damage to the US, although usually not without suffering a good deal of damage themselves. Other nations, if they'd like to get at the United States, might leverage new weapons of hybrid warfare, carrying out cyber attacks and worming their way into sensitive areas. In the last year, the US has discovered more and more about the ways China has been able to infiltrate critical American infrastructure and seek out valuable intelligence via methods that don't require a single person to set foot on US soil. At other times, a nation might consider engaging in acts of sabotage against the US, much in the same way as American domestic extremists have increasingly looked to carry out sabotage against the power grid, water infrastructure, and more. And speaking of terrorism, a nation or a non-state actor looking to do harm to the United States might do it via a terror attack. Just see the events of 9/11 to understand the sheer potency of a terror attack as a weapon against America. And nations that seek to diminish or undermine American military might can do it on their own terms, luring the United States into unfavorable engagements abroad rather than trying to attack at home. Look at the success of guerrilla forces against the US in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere over the last half-century. If an adversarial actor can get US troops onto their own soil, then those troops and thus American interests are far easier to damage or attack. Just imagine what, say, China could do, luring America into a war on its own terms in Taiwan and the South Pacific compared to what it could achieve by attacking America outright. We lay out these alternatives that hostile powers can consider not just because they constitute real mechanisms to harm the United States without invasion, but because they are the final reason why an all-out invasion of the United States is so incredibly implausible for a nation to attempt. Not only is it nearly impossible to get troops to US soil, not only is it nearly impossible to achieve military victory once you get there, but if you're a nation that considers itself a US adversary, you don't need to go to all the trouble of an invasion. If I tell you I'm going to give you a cookie, if you ask nicely, and I explain that I'll also give you that same cookie with no improvement in the quality of the reward or the circumstances around it if you walk the length of the Orient Express, the choice is simple. You're gonna ask nicely, get the bloody cookie, and decline the opportunity to expend incredible amounts of effort for an endeavor that won't make the reward any sweeter. We've listed out many reasons why an invasion of the US is functionally impossible, but this is the reason that such an invasion simply won't happen. If another nation or non-state actor wishes harm to the US, then they can save themselves a hell of a lot of pain, tremendous losses, and incredible embarrassment by simply going about it another way. Yes, there are people in the world who occasionally need reminding that invading another country is not a good idea. We're looking at you, Vlad. But when the country in question is the US, it is crystal clear to anybody who'd ever consider it that invasion simply is not worth the trouble. Thank you for watching.